Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus. It's always foggy up here on this mountain. The Greek gods live here, and they pass down supposedly completely impartial judgments on anything and everyone, and of course that's what we're trying to do, but, it's always blooming foggy. But that's our aspiration anyway. My name's Mike Pierce.
And my name is Coel Campo, and this is our second episode in our series that we've called Fighting Free of God. And so it looks like our episode for today starts with a question. Did the Enlightenment bring light?
Well, that's an important question. Of course, this whole series is about secularization. How did the West become so secular? Last week, we looked at the very important social processes that have changed us, whether we want to be changed or not. Today we're going to start looking at some of the intellectual changes that have changed how we think, what ideas are current. I always want to put the word enlightenment in thick quotation marks. But that's because I'm a stickler and a swine, as you know. I'm not sure really that it did bring light. In some ways, yes, but it mainstreams into Western society some profoundly harmful ideas, actually, that are still with us and have blighted us, perhaps especially in our political life, but also in our moral life ever since. And I think that'll become as we go through this. Most scholars quite rightly point to a difference between the British and American Enlightenment and the French one. The French one was much more sharply secularist and clearly opposed to, certainly to revealed religion. Whereas, although that element certainly was present both in what were then, of course, the American colonies and Britain itself, it was far less sharp. And the reason for that is because the political establishment leaned far less heavily on an official church than it did in France, where it leaned on the Catholic Church for support. So if you wanted to introduce new ideas, and the Catholic Church in the 3 centuries after the Reformation was very leery about new ideas, it was much freer to discuss in a broadly Protestant atmosphere where there was de facto religious toleration.
Right.
So, to my mind, at least, some of the stuff that it brought, it does not really count as light.
Which is not exactly a popular opinion among historians, right? I mean, everybody is supposed to talk about the Enlightenment in these like grandiose terms, right?
Well, not just amongst historians, amongst people generally, because we have all been totally shaped by the ideas that we're going to look at today. Right? What tends to happen in societies is that the ideas of philosophers in one age, if they are accepted, seep down, and when I say dumbed down, I'm not trying to be rude here, even though usually, of course, I am. I simply mean that they are simplified to the level that ordinary people can absorb them, and several generations up the road become part of what they are brought up to think of as common sense, even though they may not be at all. Right? Because ideas that they lean on unreflectively. So we're here looking at where these ideas that set modern and postmodern Westerners apart, not only from their own ancestors, but from other societies around the world, where these come in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And so, in the grand scheme of history, this is happening after the Reformation, but before the French and American revolutions.
Yes, and one could argue about this one way or the other in respect of the American Revolution, but certainly in respect of the French Revolution, probably in respect of the American as well. The Enlightenment is kind of like the prerequisite for it, right? The people who led both of those revolutions were overwhelmingly deists rather than Orthodox Christians of any description, and their thought world had been shaped by the kind of stuff that we're going to be looking at now, yes.
Well, I get the sense that we're going to be looking at the faces of some rather old gentlemen, some of whose faces may be more palatable than others.
Yes. Well, they're all probably more palatable than mine,
Right.
but we won't go there, will we, Mrs. Campo? I should say at the outset, though, even though we're not about to flash up their pictures or their paintings, because of course there isn't photography then, many of these ideas were fermented in the salon, the kind of meeting houses of high society ladies. There were a whole load of these well off women who entertained thinkers and intellectuals of the day in their salon in Paris. So that women are by no means out of the picture, as indeed they are not in our headline picture here. Well, the French thinkers we universally referred to as the philosophes. So philosophers, we might say. And we'd better start with the greatest and the most important of these, most well known, is Voltaire. He was a pretty amiable character, and I think we can see that, I suppose, from his portrait here. He is certainly opposed to established religion, but would count as a deist. A deist is someone who believes in God, but doesn't believe in revealed religion. So a kind of natural religion. We have to believe in God to account for the existence of all this. Okay, I want my lawyer, he says, my tailor, my servants, even my wife, to believe in God because it means that I shall be cheated and robbed and cuckolded less often. Cuckolded is not a term used very often these days, although it comes up a lot in Shakespeare. If a man is cuckolded, that means his wife is sleeping with somebody else. So the man has been cuckolded by the other man. If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Now, that's a pretty famous sentence and often gets applied to other things quite apart from God these days. I think Voltaire coins that semi humorous statement. But all nature cries out to us that he does exist.
So it sounds like, well, like you said, Voltaire did believe in God, but it sounds like he's even more keen that those people that he considers beneath him believe in God. What's that all about?
Well, because he thinks that this comes up quite often with the philosophe. He thinks that even though he himself doesn't go along with Christianity, it's a good thing for the lower orders to stop anarchy breaking out. So he takes the same view that even the most rigorous Catholic or state church Protestant would take on that point. So his infidelity, in the sense of unbelief, is a luxury for the likes of him and the upper crust, right, who see further in all of these things. This is all very distasteful to us. By the way, it illustrates the point that we must not run away with the fact that because these are radical ideas in the 18th century, that therefore they're pitched at ordinary people and against the establishment. Most of these Enlightenment thinkers counted as very conservative, not just by the standards of our day, but by theirs.
Hmm.
All right. They were not always, but very, very frequently quite clear that these were conversations for the elite like themselves.
So they were not necessarily the ones trying to start revolutions.
No, even though they're in the minds of loads of the people who do later on lead revolutions. One of the frustrating things I found, well, I found almost everything about trying to teach Western Civ to freshmen, but one of the frustrating things was this specific point. Stuff would come back to me in essays from students who were certain, despite everything I'd said, and despite everything that the book said, that these ideas took root amongst the working classes. Uh, it's not even sure that such a thing as the working classes quite exist at this point, but the poor at any rate, because religion was a trick played on the poor by the rich. Well, not quite. These were ideas mostly amongst the upper classes. Religious belief lower down the social scale remained very strong for a long time. Well, Voltaire strongly favoured religious toleration, and in this, as on other matters, England was his ideal. He spent some time in England, came back, loved it, and he thought, well, France needs to model itself like England. And there were some political considerations behind that. England had always been an offshore island with a far, far lower population than France, far less powerful during the Middle Ages. And by the 18th century, it was starting to catch up rapidly. By the 18th century, it had half the population of France, whereas it had been just a tiny fraction in earlier centuries. It was industrializing, the first industrial power. Its navy was already, well, not quite dominating the globe like it would, but it was on the way there. And the French, those French who were in the know, were rather concerned about this and thought that if they copied the British system, they might do a lot better. And Voltaire was certainly of that sort of opinion. So, on the subject of religious toleration, he says, go into the London Stock Exchange, a more respectable place than many a court, and you'll see representatives from all nations gathered together for the utility of men. Here, Jew, Mohammedan, and Christian deal with each other as though they were all of the same faith. He's being a little humorous here because they are of the same faith, money. Right? And only apply the word infidel to people who go bankrupt. Here, the Presbyterian trusts the Anabaptist and the Anglican accepts a promise from the Quaker. If there were only one religion in England, there'd be danger of despotism. If there were two, they'd cut each other's throats. But there are 30, and they live in peace and happiness.
Okay, so I get the sense that he's right, but why do things work out this way?
Well, he is exaggerating a bit, of course, that the vast majority of the population would have been at least formally part of the Church of England. But a limited religious toleration had come in after 1689, attempts at persecution having generally failed. And during the course of the 18th century, with a nudge and a wink, you could get away with pretty much any religious belief, even Catholicism. And so, in practice, yeah, there were a bunch of religious confessions in Britain at the time. I'm not quite sure whether you could quite have made it to 30, but you'd made it to quite a few. But his point is, if there's only one religion, then it's clearly embedded with the state, and that's going to become tyrannous. If there are two, they're going to be vying to be embedded with the state, so they'll cut each other's throats. But where there are 30, they're not trying to do any such thing. Your neighbour is just a neighbour like you and has a different religious confession. So who cares? Get on with your business, whatever it is that you have to do, including them. And of course, the American colonies were in the same kind of situation. You know, the Congregationalists of New England had tried, well, about 100 years before, back in Britain. So in their case, in the late 17th century, they too had tried persecution and it just wouldn't. And so, grumpily and grudgingly, they had got on living with difference and were also prospering. And now, Voltaire didn't have personal experience of that, but it's the same thing. And he's got a point. We don't feel threatened by minorities who are only a fraction of 1% of the population. Mm-hmm. But where there are two large groups and one's 60% and one's 40%, you might expect serious trouble. Well, as he got older, his anti-Christian venom, his animus, got rather stronger. So his philosophical dictionary of 1764, just a few years before he dies, promoted some fallacies about Christianity that have proved long-lasting. Now, have a think about whether you've actually encountered any of these. That there were 50 Gospels, which church authorities reduced to just 4. That the New Testament canon was decided upon at the Council of Nicaea in 325.
Yeah, this one I think sort of lives rent-free in most Christians' brains, I would assume.
Right. Well, it's untrue, right? You can say it was formally agreed upon, but not decided upon, at the Council of Alexandria in, I think that's 364. Yeah. The Tertullians supposedly said, I believe because it is absurd. Now, Voltaire thought that Christianity was absurd and wanted to think so. and so he wanted to put this in the mouth of a famous church father. So yeah, the second one you've come across, but the first and the third maybe not.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody. I'm sure somebody has said this outright, but yeah, I feel like the second one is just sort of an assumption at this point.
Right, right. Well, and certainly I've encountered a lot, not the idea that there were 50 Gospels, I don't think anybody seriously maintains that, but that there were a whole bunch of Gospels, most of them produced much later than the first century and generally heretical in tone, but the convergence upon just four as being genuine and coming from the apostles themselves, that there was somehow something arbitrary about this decided upon by church authorities. That idea, I think, is very, very widespread. It's pernicious, but it's certainly there today.
Isn't there another gospel in the Apocrypha, or no?
The apocryphal Gospels, and there are other apocryphal writings, the Acts of St. Thomas and the Acts of Paul and Thecla and these kinds of things. Yeah, there's a whole load of these apocryphal books, but that by definition means books that either claimed apostolic authorship, but under close inspection really aren't, or were believed by somebody at some stage to have that, and in the end it was agreed they weren't. So that's what we mean by the Apocrypha, at least in respect of the New Testament. Yeah.
Right.
Well, he also wrote in 1767 to Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, who was himself an atheist and privately detested religion, but nevertheless upheld it for his subjects. Yet anybody who was anywhere close to him knew that he was absolutely scornful of it. So Voltaire is in correspondence with him. Christianity, he says, is assuredly the most ridiculous, the most absurd, and the most bloody religion which has ever infected this world. Now, at that, I think probably a lot of our viewers, even if they're not themselves Christians, might raise an eyebrow and think, well, probably Islam's done worse than that. And of course, Islam was originally spread by the sword. Christianity, nothing of the sort. But Voltaire is living in the mid-18th century, so we are still deeply in reaction against the horrible wars of religion that have been fought from, well, seriously, from, let's say, from the 1540s through to the 1640s in different places, particularly the last one, the ghastly 30 Years' War. And so they're as much in reaction to that as we are, say, now to the Nazis. So he's in reaction against all that. Your Majesty will do the human race an eternal service by extirpating this infamous superstition. I do not say among the rabble, who are not worthy of being enlightened and who are apt for every yoke. I say among honest people, among men who think, among those who wish to think.
So this is the same idea as before, right? That religion is good for the lower orders, but not for quote unquote us.
Right, right. And of course, already there was something true about that, even before people like Voltaire speak up, in that since 1648 and the end of the last and worst of the wars of religion, official religion had been treated by monarchs in Protestant and Catholic countries alike as a way of keeping ordinary people in order, maintaining social order. Don't encourage religious enthusiasm, even on behalf of the official church, because that might lead to quarrels or religious upheavals. Just have a dead outward conformity. And in a different way, these rationalist philosophes are saying the same kind of thing. Well, that will certainly, in the next century, in the 19th century, that will play into the hands of Marx and people who are influenced by him, who want to say, well, look, religion is just a trick played by the rich on the poor.
Right.
Okay, well, let's consider another of these pretty important figures, Denis Diderot. He is generally put down as an atheist, but as we can see here, he might well have counted simply as an agnostic. Oh God, I do not know if you exist. I ask nothing in this world, for the course of events is determined by its own necessity if you do not exist. In other words, if there's no God, then everything that happens is simply caused by the previous moment. So the cause of things is within themselves, in material forces playing themselves out. or by your decree, if you do. Here I stand as I am, a necessarily organized part of external and necessary matter, or perhaps your own creation. So he's kind of playing with the idea, showing what the alternatives are here, and leaning towards the former.
So it sounds like he's also a deist, or he's not.
Well,
But he's not really sure.
at the most, he is a deist, but he's frequently listed as an atheist. Here, he sounds more like an agnostic.
Right. Okay, I
But
see.
I suspect that actually he is an atheist, and he's writing this simply to show in a playful way what the alternatives are. Right?
I see.
Um, no God, then the course of events is within itself in the material world. Material forces playing themselves out. Just that. Well, Helvetius, his most notorious book was De l'Esprit on Mind, and he argued that all human knowledge comes from physical sensation. He's not alone in that. We'll come to David Hume in a moment. And that people are motivated simply by pleasure and self interest. There is no fixed good and evil. Well, his publication is greeted with horror by the monarchy and the church, and the book was burned by the public hangman. That sounds rather odd to us, but that's not unique. If something was outrageous enough, the book would be burned by the hangman, with a strong implication that the author should probably be hanged too. And so he hastened to write retractions. Well, now let's come to someone who is definitely an atheist, and it's Paul-Henri Thierry Baron, who's both German and French. And he says if we go back to the beginning, we should find that ignorance and fear created the gods, that fancy, enthusiasm, or deceit adorned or disfigured them, and that weakness worships them, that credulity preserves them, and that customs, respect, and tyranny support them.
He's saying to go back to the beginning. What beginning is he going back to?
Well, I don't think he knows.
Oh,
And I think he would admit that he doesn't know. It's probably really a rhetorical flourish. At some point, he's saying religion has emerged in human society. As I say, he definitely is an atheist. He's also was a favourite of the new atheists a couple of decades ago. All his stuff started to resurface, his writings and his arguments, and so on. Enthusiasm, by the way, has a meaning until, I don't know, about 3 decades into the 19th century. We need to point out here. Enthusiasm for us is generally considered to be a good quality, or at least a neutral one. Before then, it's negative and means something like fanatical, or that you've been taken over on your insides by either a literal but more likely a metaphorical spirit somehow. You're not thinking straight.
so this is definitely not a flattering description of religion.
Well, clearly not. No, no. The harshest, I think, of the secularist thinkers of the 18th century. But certainly not the greatest mind, but still that was his big thing. Well, one of the most important thinkers of the century is this man, David Hume, a very likable fellow, generous, a very skeptical cast of mind. Now, we're going to come to some of these British thinkers here. I say British, the most important ones tend all to be Scots. And David Hume is a Scot too. So this sentence, it shows his rather droll sense of humour. He's making fun, and you're supposed to be laughing with him. He didn't believe in Christianity, and certainly he doesn't believe in miracles. But he says the Christian religion was not only the first attended by miracles, but even at this day cannot be believed by any reasonable person without one. So he's giving an outward sound of respectfulness whilst making fun. What he's saying is, you didn't see a miracle, did you? Well, what are you doing believing in Christianity then? Because, like Helvetius, he thinks that everything that we know comes from our sense experiences. Whilst religion isn't the only area that he writes about, it is an important one for him, and it's obviously the one that we're going to be focusing on here. In his book, The Natural History of Religion, He says the whole frame of nature bespeaks an intelligent author. He was not an atheist. He was definitely a deist, right? And he rather disapproved of atheists. The whole frame of nature bespeaks an intelligent author, and no rational inquirer can, after serious reflection, suspend his belief a moment with regard to the primary principles of genuine theism and religion.
But theism is revealed religion, so he doesn't believe in that, does he?
No, he doesn't. I think he's misspoken, or maybe we should. Misspoken is a word we use a lot these days, isn't it? Miswritten, if that's a word, should probably be applied here. Yeah, theism is revealed religion, and that's what he's tilting his pen against, right? Deism is his thing, yeah. The greatest crimes have been found in many instances compatible with a superstitious piety and devotion. What he's saying is, if you believe utterly in some revealed religion, and you think that the defense of it depends upon enacting violence or doing something terrible to its opponents, well, you might do that. And therefore, this is not reasonable. And therefore, it's a bad thing. And finally, another excerpt from this: the more tremendous the divinity is represented, the more, for example, preachers stress the omnipotence of God. Or now remember, he's in a Scottish background where the very Calvinistic Kirk is the Presbyterian Church is the national church, and that's going to want to stress that God makes everything that happens happen. And a lot of preachers were very good at laying that down, right? The more tremendous the divinity is represented, the more tame and submissive do men become to his ministers. And the more unaccountable the measures of acceptance required by him, by God, the more necessary does it become to abandon our natural reason and yield to their ghostly guidance and direction. Ghostly back then meant what we would now use the word spiritual, their spiritual guidance and direction. So what he's saying gently is, if you go along with revealed religion, you're actually submitting yourself to the authority of clergy. Now, this is where people who think like Hume in both Britain and in the American colonies could get away with an awful lot, right? Because it had been a mainstay of Protestant, state church Protestant propaganda to rail against superstition. That was one of their favourite words, and that meant extra biblical Catholic beliefs. Right. So Protestantism was bringing in scripture and against the traditions of mere humans, right, which was superstition. And on the other hand, to rail against the sects, Baptists, Quakers, people like this, who were enthusiasts. So it was open to 18th century rationalists to use this language, slashing both right Catholicism and left the sects, right? But actually, what you were doing was clobbering the core content of Christian belief itself, while still implying, at least, that you were a good Protestant. And this is one thing that enabled rationalism to make its home safely in the bosom of the official Protestant churches, as happened in the Church of England, as happened in the end in the Church of Scotland, and as happened also amongst the Congregationalists in New England. Right. So for every Jonathan Edwards, there was a Charles Chauncey. So this was going on there too.
I was going to say this does sound a little bit like how a cult would get started.
Well, cults tend to depend on very forceful leaders who demand submission to themselves, and Hume is certainly not doing that. But it's certainly being insidious, if that's what you mean. Yes, it's using familiar and perfectly acceptable language and stretching it to mean something very different, and that certainly is what's going on here, and not just with Hume. Yes.
Right.
Well, and in his book of miracles, he says, when anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then, and not till then, can he pretend to command my belief or opinion. In other words, if someone comes and says, I saw someone rise from the dead, my instinct is to disbelieve him and think that he's either deceiving me or deceiving himself. But only if I come to think that this person is really of sound mind and telling the truth, and that person telling an untruth would be more unlikely than someone rising from the dead. At that point, I can come to believe in the resurrection of the dead. By the way, of course, a lot of modern Christian apologists have taken Hume at his word and continue to do so, because if you consider the likelihood of all the people who were witnesses to the resurrected Jesus submitting themselves to be put to death in all kinds of grisly ways and living tortured lives for as long as they did live, or that Jesus rose from the dead, well, I think that passes Hume's test. Now, whether he'd thought about that or not, I don't know, but I have my doubts. Perhaps you've heard a lot of Christians use precisely this argument.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right, and in effect, what they're doing is taking David Hume at his word. Right
Right.
then, if that's the way it is, let's try this. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Hume argued against all claimed miracles having happened, since people lie because they wish either to be famous or to benefit their religion. People enjoy miracle stories and want them to be true. Most miracle accounts occur in ignorant and barbarous nations, he said, or long ago, among people who knew little of the laws of natural causation. That's a very sketchy argument.
Well, an awful lot of people in rich countries now believe in miracles happening today, so
Yes, yes. Well, what do you think if we could resurrect Mr. Hume for a minute and bring him back to answer your question? What do you think he might say to that point?
that everybody's been taken in. I don't know.
Yeah, I think he might fall back on some social snobbery and say, "Well, look at the kinds of people who do this," right, or something like that. And partly he might have a point, but a lot of pretty highly educated people
Right.
would make similar kinds of claims and who are not crazy. But people in the past were not ignorant of the laws of natural causation, even if they wouldn't have used that language. Back in the first century AD, people generally knew that if someone was dead, they were dead. As has often been pointed out about Hume's argument, it's kind of question begging. And one particular Scottish clergyman, George Campbell, took him up on all of this argument and answered him on it. And Hume replied, what did he say? Something like the Scottish theologue has bested me, or something like. He admitted defeat privately on this. Yeah, there's too many question begging kind of elements to his argumentation here. But he does also say that the miraculous accounts of rival religions can hardly all be true. So if the others are invented, perhaps those of one's favoured religion are too.
Yeah, this one's a pretty strong argument, though, isn't it?
It is a strong argument, yeah. And I think Christians today really need to think, well, what are you going to say about miracles or purported miracles happening under what's the word I want here? Aegis, is that the right word? Of other religious faiths. If you want to debunk them, you want to be very careful that the same thing can't be done to yours.
Right.
And if you want to defend yours, you might need to look awfully carefully at theirs and think about exactly how you're going to explain that. Yeah. We're just opening a can of worms here, aren't we? Because we're not going to give the answers. Moving swiftly on. Right. From philosophers now to a historian. And the most famous of the lot in the 18th century is Edward Gibbon, author of the massively influential The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which has remained in print ever since. Although I think, I could be wrong in this, but I think most editions these days are generally abridged. But back when I was about 16 and the course of my life was already starting to become clear to some of my relatives, my uh, uh, lovely great uncle had the 6 volumes of Gibbon's Decline and Fall and realised he was never going to read them and gave them to me. And alas, they're no longer in my possession. But his book has been described frequently as a long, sly attack on Christianity. He says, I have described the triumph of barbarism and religion. And his argument was that basically the adoption of Christianity brought about the downfall of the Roman Empire.
Is he
Okay.
necessarily wrong about that?
Well, in terms of strict chronology, there's one thing to be said in favour of it and another massive thing to be said against it. Here's the case for Gibbon. Christianity is persecuted until 312. From 313 onward, it is formally tolerated and indeed encouraged and given all kinds of benefits under the Emperor Constantine. From the 380s, it effectively, under Theodosius, becomes the official religion, at least not being a Christian, perhaps in thick quotation marks, is getting very difficult. Pagan sacrifice is outlawed. And in the late 4th century and early 5th, that's when the barbarians invade, particularly in the early 5th. They sweep across the Rhine and crash. So, cause and effect? Well, we all know that post hoc ergo propter hoc is a fallacy. After this, therefore, because of this, is a logical fallacy, right? But pagans at the time, and given, let's do a quick bit of maths here, more than 1300 years later, is arguing that Christianity undermined the Roman martial military virtues, that it sidelined a load of energies of people into unproductive work as priests, monks, nuns, and so on, and basically fixed people's minds on impractical heavenly things rather than practical things as in traditional Roman culture. Maybe there are those of us who would argue that there were other even more important causes, like population collapse, a lesson that has absolutely no relevance to the West today, of course. But the thing that should be said against him is that it's only really the Western Roman Empire that collapsed. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years. Well, as they would say up north, by gum, lad, there's not many empires that last as long as that. Right? The British Empire had, at the most generous possible estimate, 300 years in the sun, really less than that. The Pax Americana really gets going after World War II and is fading in front of our eyes. 1,000 years is pretty good going. And as was admitted on all hands, the Eastern Roman Empire was extremely religious. And Christianity was a major part, absolutely definitive of its whole culture.
So
What to say?
he just conveniently ignores this in his several volumes.
He does give an account of it, but he is perhaps the first, at least the first that I know of, in a long and extremely discreditable line of modern Western historians who absolutely disparage the Eastern Roman Empire as being pathetic, corrupt, cruel, and all the rest of it. Well, you can always find these things if you want to, but you could in any state, including in the present and certainly in the past. But it's also in the 18th century that the Eastern Roman Empire, which had always called itself Roman for hundreds of years after it no longer included Rome and spoke Greek, and had been known as the Roman Empire to its neighbours, whether enemies or friends, that it started to be called Byzantium. And mostly nowadays we refer to this as the Byzantine Empire, right?
Yes.
Well, it started in the 18th century from Westerners like Gibbon, who wanted to distance it from Rome. They wanted to praise traditional pre Christian Rome. And it was extremely inconvenient to that argument to admit that Christian Rome continued without Rome in Constantinople for another 1,000 years. Not so feeble after all of it. So, and it's another example, like the term Enlightenment, or actually Renaissance, where secular thinkers have loaded the dice, as it were, in historical discussions in their favour. Right? Who could be against the light? Okay, let's come now to Adam Smith, another Scot. He is both a moral philosopher and a protagonist of laissez-faire economics, even though it's only the latter for which he's generally remembered today. And this is a mistake, because in his mind, the two things were closely bound up together. But they were a very secular approach to how society operates and or should operate. So we'll just take little excerpts from his two most famous books. And the first one is The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So he says that the administration of the great system of the universe, the care of the universal happiness of all rational and sensible beings, sensible here in the old sense of having senses, having feelings, is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, but one much more suitable to the weakness of his powers and to the narrowness of his comprehension. The care of his own happiness, of that of his family, his friends, his country.
So Smith is arguing that God's involvement with the world is above our ability to know, but while he's secretly thinking it's beneath us.
Well, yeah, he's wanting to say we must leave that out of account. Now, that again is because he's wanting to minimize the role of religion in these kinds of considerations. But actually, he might also count in this sense as being quite conservative, certainly by our lights today. What we tend to associate mostly with Enlightenment is universalist schemes for running society. And we're going to come to this in a minute when we come to Romanticism. But what he's saying, as I think quite correctly, is not actually necessarily in conflict with religious belief at all. That your concerns need to be for those of your neighbour, your family, your country, because your ability to help people on the other side of the world is, well, to say it's limited is a huge understatement. The measure of your morality is how you treat those around you. And then you might extend that to people far away with whom you are not personally acquainted. But the more general trend of thought coming out of the 18th century is not what Smith's saying here, which is quite traditional. It's going to be towards universal schemes, but till you get to the point where today, of course, we've stood all this on its head and we judge one another on the basis of our politics. You know, we think someone immoral because they're taking the wrong stance on what's happening in Somalia or something, and ignore the fact of how they're actually treating their workmates or their immediate intimates. Okay, well, let's come now to the book that continues to be celebrated, particularly by supporters of laissez-faire economics. We're going to put a little pin in that bubble in a moment, but let's just take it for what it is for the moment. This is the most famous passage from his book. As every individual endeavours as much as he can, both to employ his capital in the support of domestic industry, and capital here might simply mean your labour, your work. It might mean your tools and other stuff as well. And so to direct that industry, that its products may be of the greatest value, every individual necessarily labours to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand, there's the famous expression, to promote an end which was no part of his intention.
I feel like a lot of Christians want to claim him in our camp with his invisible hand theory that he's talking about God.
Well, yes, but yeah, he is kind of echoing a particularly Protestant view of providence. But I think what he's saying is actually perfectly compatible with religious skepticism. What he's saying is this is just the way it works out. Now, that first half of that passage might seem a little difficult to some of us, but it's kind of explained by the second sentence. So Nobody goes out to work thinking, I'm going out to work today to raise the GNP of America or something like that, or to employ my abilities or my money or my tools or whatever in a domestic industry. Nobody does that. But then that he concedes that in the second sentence. He's saying, no, but that is what you do. You don't realize you are, but you are. You're only intending to promote your own interest. Let's take the simple case here. You go into a supermarket and you buy a packet of cookies that cost, let us say, $3.59. Right? And now the sale does not happen unless both of you gain, because the supermarket wants your $3.59 more than it wants the packet of cookies, and you want the packet of cookies more than you want your $3.59. Right? So you are both pursuing your own ends, but the net effect is to keep the wheels of commerce whirring, to keep the cookies being produced in the cookie factory, which is also keeping the sugar business and the wheat business or the flour business going, whatever it is, right? And the currants business going, etc., etc. And the same thing happens when you go out to work. You're looking for something that's going to give you the maximum remuneration for your time. And what will do that? Well, it is those parts of the economy that need you most. And how do we know they need you most? Because they will pay more than the others for a person with your level of skills, right? And so on. This is his argument. A lot of people who support laissez-faire economics think that Adam Smith is like writing them a blank check here, and he's not. Uh, this his idea about the economy is partly descriptive, but it's also completely dependent on his ideas of a moral society, in which we are moral because we are enabled to sympathize with the feelings of the people around us, and that is as it should be. And if we can't do that, then this kind of economy isn't going to work, because it depends upon an awful lot of honesty and integrity. One of the reasons that capitalism is crumbling a bit today, there are many others, but let's look at this one, it's quite important, is that we can't trust one another because the moral society has disintegrated. And how do we know that? Well, because we're constantly checking up on one another. A lot of our GNP is diverted into auditors checking up the books to make sure we're not fiddling things, tax inspectors doing the same thing, video cameras checking exactly what we're doing in public places. Right? Especially in Britain, oh my word, they've got less than 1% of the world population and 30% of the world's video cams. Go figure. They really don't trust one another. And this was the home of, an Englishman's word is his bond. It's all gone. It's all gone. Right. So that the kind of society and the economy that he's envisaging depend upon a moral citizenry. Right. Well, now we should look at Romanticism, which counts as both part of the Enlightenment and, in a sense, as counter-Enlightenment. So if all the people we've been looking at now have been looking at cold, hard reason, Romanticism is wanting to emphasize the emotional state of ourselves as being an important driving force, but also ideals, but not really religious ideals, ideals that have fought free from revealed religion. Now, we're only going to consider by far and away the most important of these, and this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, you and I discussed before we recorded this exactly how we were going to tackle this, because at some stage I want to create a series which will include stuff on him when I can give it to Jean-Jacques Rousseau with both barrels, whereas we're going to have to keep the discussion here pretty short, because I think that his influence, more than any other individual, is the most pernicious on everything that's happened since, and Western history would be utterly different without him, and I would argue an awful lot better. So he's born in Calvinist Geneva, but as a teenager goes over the border into Catholic France, converts to Catholicism, later in his life converts back to Protestantism, not because he believes in any of them really, but because he dissents from the authoritative religion of the day. That's really what's going on there. Well, we're not going to delay ourselves because this will happen in some later episode or series, more like, with the rather sordid details of his personal life and his appalling influence upon modern education systems, which to which modern schools in Britain, America, and many other countries as well are completely in thrall. So we're going to ignore all of that for now and look simply at what he has to say in the area of government and politics. His most famous work in this area by far is The Social Contract of 1762. He says, "My purpose is to consider if, in political society, there can be any legitimate and sure principle of government, taking men as they are and laws as they might be. That is, we're not going to take anything simply from tradition or inherited systems. We're going to try and invent everything de novo, right? This, like many another thinker from this period and since, is a priori reasoning. Want to try and work our way back to first principles somehow."
So he's like the biggest anti-conservative.
Yes, I would say yes. Man was born free, and he's everywhere in chains.
Now, this is his most famous saying, but it's not really immediately obvious what he means by this.
Right. Well, he's what he's wanting to say is that in people's natural condition, whatever that is, this is something he continually hypothesizes about. People are free, but they are in every actually existing polity, whether it is Royal Absolutist France, which is where he's living, or anywhere else, they are in chains as if they were slaves, right? And loads and loads of political rhetoric coming right down to the present wants to talk about people as being in chains somehow. And this goes back to Rousseau, right? So stretching the category of slavery miles and miles and miles beyond literal slavery to a metaphorical slavery, which in the end means any circumstance that the speaker happens not to like. So it goes back. So what he thinks is that it's society that makes us slaves, and that we need to find a way of getting out of that and getting back to some kind of hypothetical natural freedom. I mean, I would, when I launch on one of my rants at some future point, will want to say that actually the reality is the opposite of this. We are born in chains, slaves to our appetites. The baby cannot even articulate a thought. All it can do is scream. You know about that now, if you didn't before, don't you?
Yes, very well.
Very well. Okay, and it is society that liberates us to be able to act, that we can articulate what we want. We learn from one another, particularly from our parents, but from our teachers, from other people around us, older siblings. Again, very important in this respect, how to do things, and that is liberating. The price of that liberty is that we need to learn to comport ourselves in ways that are acceptable to those around us. Right? But if I merely scream when I don't get what I want, the results in the end will not be very good, and other people will not like me, and that will be worse. So it is more liberating to fit into society. So I would want to stand Rousseau on his head. But anyway, we will move swiftly on here. Aristotle said that men were not at all equal by nature, since some were born for slavery and others born to be masters. Aristotle was right, but he mistook the effect for the cause. Anyone born in slavery is born for slavery. Nothing's more certain. Slaves in their bondage lose everything, even the desire to be free. Now, this would be a complaint of ideologues right down to the present. The generally well-born ideologues, like Rousseau himself, nationalists in the 19th century, socialists in the 19th and 20th century, and their equivalents today, generally in fairly privileged positions themselves and with good educations, want to complain that the people, their desired beneficiaries, don't support their grandiose plans. Right? They don't even have the desire to be free. Well, Yeah. But if they are slaves by nature, it's only because there's been slavery against nature. Force made the first slaves, and their cowardice perpetuates their slavery. So he's giving a kind of an advanced explanation for why ordinary people aren't necessarily going to support his, Rousseau's, ideas. Well, here are some of the consequences. If badness comes from social arrangements, stopping it comes from changing those arrangements. So government and politics hold the key to all our problems. Now, tell me if I'm wrong here, but my impression has been, for most of my life now, that pretty much everybody around me takes this as an obvious truth. That our problems, that the solution to our problems lies in political action by a them somewhere. And if we feel like being activists, then we can pressure things in that direction.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Since badness comes from social arrangements, it's ridiculous to blame a person, especially oneself, for one's bad actions. It was all the fault of the way the person was brought up.
That's definitely true.
I would say that possibly 50% of all the people that I'm connected with on social media are claiming to be the subjects of trauma, from which trauma in quotation marks, from which they need healing. Right? And maybe many of them do. I'm not necessarily questioning individual cases. I'm just saying that the statistics are extremely unlikely. Right? Um, so we're damaged by society, whereas I myself am a pure little flower. Right? That.
Right.
If people in themselves are good and society corrupts them, it's best not to socialize them at all. Better to let them discover things for themselves than to educate them. That is at the heart of our miseducation systems, by the way.
Mm.
So my bad actions are a result of circumstances. Despite all of them, there's an inner me, a true self who is good and pure.
This, I think, definitely true. I mean, it's almost impossible to find somebody actually taking responsibility for their actions anymore, right?
Right, right. And the postulation of the true self, right? Think of how in a Christian college that we're both familiar with but must not name, we were constantly exhorted to be, quote, our best selves.
Yes.
Or, and it pains me, it really pains me to say this, the evangelical Christian George Bush, the president, after, now I'm forgetting the precise incident that it was now, but some Americans had just done something very public and very bad on the international stage. Perhaps someone can remind us in the comments box what it was. And he came out with the phrase, "This is not who we really are." Right? So there's a true self who, despite the evidence of the fact that I've demonstrably just cheated, stolen, or lied, right, is nevertheless good and pure.
Right.
Rousseau. Right? And this idea of romanticized idea, particularly the romanticized self, saturates almost every TV program, every film, every pop song that you've ever seen or heard. It's just part of the wash of the whole society by now.
If only Rousseau knew how popular he was going to become.
Yes, yes. So, and of course, all of this is extremely secularizing because it stands totally in contrast to what Christianity has said about who and what people are. But it's also pointing them to solutions lying in politics and not in our own behavior. Right. So now, and of course, before people fly at me, I'm not saying that there weren't any political changes needed to be made, or that there aren't any needed to be made now. That's not the point. But it's Rousseau who drives towards putting all our eggs in that basket.
Mm.
So I was not at all surprised, and indeed very pleased, when on encountering Carl Trueman's absolutely amazing book from, is it 3 years ago now, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is a little heavyweight, and so another edition was brought out for the general reader, Strange New World. They're basically the same book. It's basically a study of the trajectory of modern self-understanding. And he begins, quite rightly, with Rousseau. So, yeah, these thinkers contribute enormously to the secularization of serious intellectual thought and leave theology as a kind of sidetrack on the main line of intellectual life. And with the passing of the years, as always happens, these ideas saturate down through society, are dumbed down in the process. And again, I'm not using that in a pejorative sense. They're simply simplified to be accessible to ordinary people. And then several generations later, they have become, received wisdom and what a lot of ordinary people think is common sense, even though, of course, it's not common at all. Yeah.
Yeah, I found reading Truman's book to be so helpful because I think there's a certain power that we can gain from understanding where our roots come from, like why people think the way that they do now. And now understanding that, or understanding like this journey that he takes you on from Rousseau to the present,
Right.
was really helpful in looking at the people around me because now I can say, oh, well, they've just been influenced by a couple hundred years of history.
Right. Right. Well, as we all have, inevitably.
Right.
But then, if we know what that is, then we're in a position to make choices. Because the great thing about Truman's book is it's not remotely polemical. Somebody who wants to disagree with everything that he's arguing for at the end of the book could take almost no issue with anything that he says for the first 90%.
Right. Right.
It's just
Because
an
it's just
analysis of what's
history.
going on. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. And with that book plug, I guess we'd better wrap it up for today. And we're going to come back and look at the extremely secularizing effects of nationalism. And we will consider that next week. So thank you for staying with us, everybody. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Bye bye, everyone.
Bye bye now.